Detroit, known as Motor City or Motown, Detroit is located in Michigan, a state with beautiful landscapes, a variety of cultures and food, and below-average sports teams. At the beginning of the 20th century, Detroit was the epicenter of all things to do with cars. This led to rapid industrialization and enormous prosperity. The increase in high-paying jobs in the great city led to a rapid population growth. However, as manufacturing costs increased and overseas competition rose, auto companies' profits got squeezed. As auto productions declined, job opportunities also declined. This resulted in workers seeking jobs elsewhere and a steep drop in the population and economy of Detroit. During the same period, racial tension and union strikes accelerated the decline of Detroit, eventually resulting in one of the biggest fall from graces ever seen in history.
In the beginning of the 20th century, Detroit was booming. Detroit was the epicenter of all things relating to the auto industry in America. Detroit became the Motor City in large part because of their advantageous geographical location. Centrally located in America and right of the Great Lakes, Detroit was able to access raw materials and had logistical advantages over other large cities. Raw materials like iron ore, timber, and coal were available around the region. Water routes and rail systems made it easy to move cars and parts to major cities throughout the country. Detroit is also close to big cities like Chicago and New York, which provided easy access to the major financial markets. Detroit was, in a way, like today's Silicon Valley. It served as the hub for the major American car manufacturers, Ford, GM, and Chrysler, which enabled the sharing of innovation and best practices. As the Detroit-based auto companies dominated the auto sector, Detroit became one of the fastest-growing cities in the history of America. In fact, its population gained about 1.8 million people in 50 years, which is approximately 36,000 people a year, which made it the fourth largest city at the time. For context, Phoenix, the current fifth most populous city in America, has 400,000 less people than Detroit in the 1950s, and Phoenix was founded 30 years before Detroit. However, after a steep rise in population for 50 years, multiple problems in the city started to rise, which lit a spark for the downfall of Detroit.
The initial downfall of Detroit started in the early 1950s. It was largely due to 5 problems facing the city. Number 1. All eggs in one basket or reliance on a single industry. Detroit's economy was centered around the production of cars. It was called Motor City. When international competition increased and when some of the automation of car production replaced humans, tens of thousands of jobs were lost, and people were forced to move away. Also, at the same time, the economic crisis in 1970 and the economic recession in 1980 put further pressure on the profits of the auto industry, resulting in loss of jobs and exacerbating the exodus of residents searching for jobs elsewhere.
Number 2. Union strikes. Detroit had many union strikes during this time. Labor costs, healthcare, pensions costs, and other economic factors increased, which thereby made the cost for these companies increase as well. With these strikes, plants had to close, some permanently, which resulted in workers exiting the city.
Number 3. Racial tensions. When Southern blacks began to move to Detroit in search of already scarce jobs, they were met with less than friendly attitudes from the remaining white business owners. During this period of time, white and black people refused to work with each other at the same plants. After the racial riots of 1967, Detroit was largely unable to bounce back. Number 4. Impact of poverty. In the average U.S. city, 17.4% of people live below the poverty line. In Detroit, however, 36% of residents live below the poverty line, more than double the amount in most cities. Because of the low income, people are unable to pay enough money in taxes to provide their neighbors with social services like unemployment benefits, food stamps, Medicaid, and welfare assistance. This makes life almost unbearable for those in the lowest quintile who are forced to move out.
And finally, number 5. Poor leadership. Many cities have had a financial crisis before, like Austin, Texas, and Cary, North Carolina. These cities bounced back while Detroit didn't, though. That is because Detroit has had some poor excuses for leaders. To name a few, there's Charles E. Bowles. Bowles served office for 7 months in 1930. There was a spike in crime and he was suspected to be linked to Detroit's underground workings. It was figured out that he was being backed up by the KKK, and when Detroit figured this out, he was swiftly kicked out of office. After Bowles was Edward Jeffries. Jeffries served from 1940 to 1948. He is known for developing the Detroit Plan, which raised 100 acres for redevelopment. However, these acres never redeveloped and rather sat vacant for many years. This caused around 7,000 black people to leave their city. Following Jeffries' tenure was Albert Cobo. Cobo served from 1950 to 1957. He had declined federal money for housing and rather used it for highways. Ironically, these highways let more people leave the dying city. After Cobo left office, Coleman A. Young became mayor of Detroit. Young was mayor from 1973 to 1993. Young promised to ease tension between the blacks and police, which was somewhat effective. However, white neighborhoods turned into war zones, and a lot of whites were driven out of town. In 1989, Young was taking control of a city that was 70% black. Because of this, he was mayor for as long as he was. Following Young was Kwame M. Kilpatrick. Kilpatrick was the mayor of Detroit from 2001 to 2008. Unlike the others, he actually did some good for the city. He brought in many new attractions and actually invested in many businesses. However, his mayor term ended abruptly in 2008, as he was convicted of fraud, racketeering, and extortion. Because of this, he needed to serve 4 months in jail, and he needed to pay a fine of $1 million to the city. To round out this group of Detroit leaders is Dave Bing. NBA fans might recognize the name Dave Bing, as he is a former Detroit Piston. Because of his fame, it is easy to see why he was elected as mayor. However, he didn't do much. During his term, there were numerous announcements of cuts to the city's workforce, efforts to fill annual budget deficits, and urgent calls for sacrifices from labor groups. However, Bing didn't do any of this. In March of the same year, Michigan appointed Kevin Dior, a veteran lawyer, as an emergency manager to Bing. This, paired with his somewhat obliviousness to his situation, made Bing one of the most ineffective leaders in Detroit history. The North American Free Trade Agreement, or NAFTA, was initiated in 1994. NAFTA was an agreement between the US, Canada, and Mexico that allowed free trade between these countries. This resulted in an explosion of trade between these three countries. However, this contributed to the US having job losses and manufacturing outsourcing, especially when there are many low-wage companies in Mexico carrying automotive production there. For example, in 1994, the year that NAFTA was introduced, the US lost around 350,000 jobs in the auto industry, which is about 1/3 of them. This deal felt quite one-sided for Mexico, considering their employment rate increased by more than 400% and has become a major location for cars and manufacturing since 1994. The US, or more specifically Detroit, however, went in the opposite direction. Detroit continued to lose workers, eventually dropping under 50% of the people Detroit had in 1950. More and more jobs were being cut because NAFTA allowed places other than Detroit to have a successful auto industry.
On July 18, 2013, the city of Detroit filed for Stage 9 bankruptcy. With $18.5 billion of debt, it is the largest municipal bankruptcy filing in U.S. history. Detroit went bankrupt because of the large number of abandoned houses made revenue fall. Rising foreclosures and unemployment after the Great Recession of 2008 took a huge toll on the city's ability to provide welfare services to the loyal residents. This problem prompted more residents to move to suburbs of Detroit where life was generally safer, less crowded, and more prosperous. The exodus of Detroit created a large problem for the city, especially with tax revenues, who had to work progressively harder to retain the same number of residents. Almost 9 years after Detroit declared bankruptcy, Detroit's population is decreasing at a slower rate. Its population of 639,000 is still steadily declining and represents only 35% of the people Detroit had in 1950. The city still falls into financial problems like housing foreclosures and high unemployment and poverty rates. Tax efficiency rate has been about 30%, while the unemployment rate has reached a high of whopping 25%. The city infrastructure continues to fail to provide basic needs like their water supply, which can be attributed to the Flint water crisis. An article published by the Detroit Free Press illuminates the daily struggle of residents who have to choose between electricity and heat, healthcare and unemployment benefits, or even food and housing.
Unfortunately for many, Detroit serves for the rest of the United States as an example of what will happen if one city relies too heavily on one industry and doesn't adjust to market shifts. Detroit was once a thriving city known for its industrial innovations. But when faced with international competition and technology shifts, the Detroit auto companies did not evolve with continued innovations. As the auto companies struggled, their revenues declined, resulting in many job cuts. Consequently, people left Detroit to find employment elsewhere. This resulted in a downward spiral. The decrease in income and property taxes led to drops in services and an increase in crime, ultimately resulting as an abundance of people leaving Detroit. After the automotive industry relocated out of Detroit, hundreds of thousands were left without jobs, homes, and income. As a result, millions of residents moved out of the declining city in search of a better life. The consistent exodus of inhabitants created a circular problem. As a result of the exodus, Detroit couldn't get enough money from their taxes to provide services to their taxpayers, who then consequently moved out of the city. Our hope is that Chicago doesn't follow the pattern Detroit set. While Chicago is more diversified in industry than Detroit was, it still has experienced many manufacturing failures as a result of a shift to the information age. People are leaving Chicago to seek jobs in other cities with growing industries, like San Francisco and Austin. Similar to Detroit, Chicago's crime has increased while tax income has decreased. In addition, budgets for infrastructure and services are constrained. We hope that Chicago reverses their migration issues by observing the downfall of Detroit and by being more innovative and responsive to the evolving markets, ultimately achieving what Detroit could not.